Hey folks, thanks for clicking on this video. This week I'm a little behind, it is tax extension season, so instead of our normal scripted content, today I'll be sharing footage from a Q&A session that I did with the Sacred Capital community a few weeks ago. And in this Q&A I showcased a tool that I had been working on, which was the result of sort of a thought experiment that I had in putting together all these moving pieces in a pastor's personal finances. Here's the thought experiment. As a pastor, when you pay off your mortgage, you lose a big chunk of your housing allowance, right? Because your housing allowance can only be as high as your actual housing expenses. And what's the bulk of most pastors' housing expenses? It's their mortgage. So, right when you pay off your mortgage, your housing allowance drops precipitously. So, here's the question that I had. Is it better off for a pastor to refinance their mortgage and extend the term in order to milk the housing allowance for as long as you possibly can? Or would that be worse because you end up paying more interest to the bank? Turns out it's a pretty complicated question with a few moving parts. And so what did I do? I created a tool that does all the work for you. So in this Q&A, I introduced and showcased this tool that you can use as a pastor to optimize when the proper time is to pay off your mortgage. Also this week, I wrote a full blog article talking about this idea, link in the description. So go check that out. Also check out the link where you can download this tool yourself and follow along as you watch. Let's jump into it. So today what we're going to be going over is I want to go over another tool that I've developed. Last week we talked about the housing allowance tool and how that works. I have another tool that's in the resources section, and this is a refinance calculator. Now, this is what I love about being a financial planner and a tax professional, and also just like an analyst by temperament. Like I love just optimizing systems. Like I love taking all this disparate information and putting it together into something where it all synergizes together and it all works together. And one of the things that is interesting about pastors in particular, especially those that are taking a housing allowance, is that means that they get a tax exclusion for their housing expenses. So, and that would include things like mortgage interest. So a pastor who has a mortgage payment, say they're paying $2,000 a month, over 30 years, and that housing payment is set to expire. That mortgage is going to get paid off after that 30 years. Well, what happens after that 30 years to their tax benefit? What happens to their housing allowance? Well, the housing allowance can only be as high as the actual expenses that the pastor pays for housing, and that includes the mortgage. And so once that $2,000 a month goes away, that's $24,000 a year that just disappears from their housing allowance. Like they lose that tax benefit. And so the temptation, and you can take your housing allowance into retirement, by the way, if you have the right kind of church plan, and if you've planned correctly and have saved for retirement in that church plan, typically a 403b, then you can take distributions in retirement out of that plan and you can count it as housing allowance. A lot of pastors don't know that. Your housing allowance does not end just because you stop working in ministry. It can extend beyond that into retirement. And so housing allowance preservation is a big part of what I do when I work with pastors, either in a coaching capacity or otherwise, is really planning for, okay, how do we maximize your housing allowance into retirement? Now, the temptation is, okay, so we know that we have this sunset of the mortgage, and that means a sunset of the housing allowance benefit, right? Well, instead of just losing all that benefit cold turkey, when we pay off the house, what if we did a refinance, right? What if we took the existing loan and we replaced it with a longer loan? Say you're set to pay it off in 10 years, and you say, well, maybe I'll open up a 15-year or even like a 30-year mortgage. At this point, the payment goes down, but at least you get the benefit for longer. So that's the temptation. The flip side to that is, and this is kind of unfair, is that you have to kind of choose, you kind of get one or the other. You can either get the benefit of not paying as much in mortgage interest because if you pay off your mortgage early, of course, you're not paying as much interest, right? Because then you own the home free and clear, you're paying no interest. So it's not like the housing allowance is not free money. It's just a discount on your housing expenses. And so when your mortgage interest goes away, yeah, you lose the tax benefit, but you're also not paying any interest to the bank. And so that's the trade-off. And so really the mathematical question is, at what point do you break even? Is there a set of circumstances where you would be better off extending the mortgage and refinancing versus just paying it off? And so I have a tool here that takes all of that complicated nonsense, because the break-even point has to do with a lot of different factors. It has to do with what's your tax bracket. It has to do with what's your interest rate, both the existing interest rate and the interest rate that you're considering with the refinance. How many months are left on the loan? How many months are you considering for a mortgage? And how does that all compare to just paying it off outright? Like, say you get a windfall inheritance tomorrow. And then the question is like, okay, well, do I pay off my house completely or not? So this tool essentially takes all those scenarios and it compares them all, and I'll show you how it works. And this is kind of a cool one. I like this. In general, I like paying off debt, but again, pastors have special rules because they have special circumstances. And so, I want to kind of just show um, what that could look like. All right, so let me find, what are we doing? Okay, here we go. All right, so let's share this refinance calculator, and you can go into this community. You can go under tools and resources. In the resource section, there should be a refinance calculator place where you can read the post and you can download this exact tool. This is an Excel tool. This one only has really only one place to look, one tab. That's what I was trying to figure out. It only has one tab. You do have disclosures here that, of course, I would recommend that you read. But all the magic happens just on this first tab. So again, there's a place you can put your name. Pastor John Doe lives at 123 Main Street. And the only real information we need is your highest marginal tax rates. And if you do your taxes, or if you have a tax preparer doing your taxes, you should be able to ask them and they can give you an answer on what that is. Excuse me. And this is both federal and state. I happen to live in California, which has notoriously high taxes. And so you'd have to find out both with housing allowance. So this would be like, assuming you're doing it right, you are claiming a housing allowance. This is really what your marginal tax rates are for federal and state today, like right now. Without housing allowance, what would happen is you would have to get with your tax guy, or we can get together on coaching and we can find out, okay, what would your marginal tax rates be? How would they change if you couldn't take your housing allowance on your mortgage? So the mortgage goes poof, bye-bye. That means that, again, with the situation, you have $2,000 a month going to your mortgage. That's $24,000 a year that now becomes fully taxable to you. So what would that do to your marginal tax rate? Well, it would probably increase it. And so this is important because we're trying to kind of look at two scenarios, and I'll show you what this means. So I'm just going to keep them both at the low 12% right now. But it is conceivable that, say, if you were to lose your housing allowance for your mortgage, maybe your federal goes up to 22%, and that would change the math a little bit. Let me explain a little bit why this is necessary. So let's look here at this point, this part here, the current mortgage versus the refinance scenario. So you put in, and again, I'm using kind of light green as the input sections here. Everything else you shouldn't have to touch. Principal balance, this is how much money is currently left on your mortgage. So I put 80,000 here as just kind of a placeholder. What's your current interest rate? Say it's 4%. Some of us are sitting on, like maybe 3.25% or doing, crazy like that. Like maybe we got back in the kind of, mid 2000s, 20 teens, where interest rates were just crazy. Nowadays interest rates are going to be a little bit higher, maybe in the fives, so like maybe like a 5.75 or something like that. So you'd put in your current interest rate and then how many months before you have to pay it off, so 96, divided by 12. So we're looking at, so you have 8 years left on this mortgage is what this is. And so what this does is this breaks down over here in this column how much you're actually paying for that mortgage. So your monthly principal and interest payment should be this much. If this is your loan, then your monthly payment should be $947.48. If it's higher, it might be because you're bundling in property taxes and insurance and things like that into the escrow account. But those things would remain, so after you pay off your mortgage, you still pay property taxes, you still pay insurance. So that's not the part that we're considering here, because that would still stay, and you can still claim that part as a housing allowance. What would go away would be specifically the principal and interest portion of your payment. And so just from this information, we can deduce what the principal and interest is. And I have all this crazy math you can see up here to determine what that is. Total interest. And so what this is, and this is useful just in general, even if you not considering refinancing, just knowing over the course of these 8 years before this mortgage is paid off, how much are you going to pay in total interest over that 8 years? And it turns out that even at 3.25%, really low, over 8 years, you're paying $10,950, almost $11,000 in total interest to the bank over that time period, not counting all the interest you've paid so far. So, if you know anything about mortgage math, they front load on the interest, so the proportion of your principal and interest payment that goes to interest is at its highest at the very beginning, and you pay very little principal. And then every payment as it goes throughout the course of your loan, the interest portion goes down and the principal portion goes up. So the principal portion is you paying yourself equity in the house. The interest is what goes to the bank. So just the way it works mathematically, the bank takes more interest at the beginning, and then the longer the loan goes, the less interest they actually take. But even though we're on the back 8 years of what ostensibly was a 30-year loan, even with a low interest rate of 3.25%, you're still paying almost $11,000 in total interest from this moment on for the rest of that loan. And I feel like that's really eye-opening. Like people don't all the time think about how much they're actually paying in interest for these mortgages. So Dave Ramsey starts to make a lot more sense, just getting rid of debt where you can. Okay, this one's where the real money happens right here. Housing allowance taxes saved. So this is why we're looking at your marginal tax rates up here, because we're taking this scenario where we're assuming this $947.48 a month. This helps substantiate your housing allowance. And so you're taking a tax benefit for that housing allowance, and that's being offset by the interest. So it's interesting in this particular situation, your housing allowance taxes saved is actually almost equal to the total interest you're paying as a pastor. So this is the cool thing about the housing allowance for pastors, like your tax benefit from your housing allowance can essentially subsidize your mortgage payment, the interest that you're paying in mortgage. So if you were to just pay it off, well, this shows me that if you were to pay it off today, it would, it'd be a wash. Like, if you had the money, if you had $80,000 sitting in the bank and you said, I want to consider either paying off my mortgage early and just paying it all off right now, getting rid of the mortgage, you lose a bit of your housing allowance benefit, but you also don't pay any more interest. It looks like you're going to turn out about even. And that's what this immediate payoff scenario is meant to show. Immediate payoff shows your net savings. So this is taking your total interest that you're saving and then subtracting out the total taxes that you're saving from the housing allowance. So this person has a really good loan. They actually end up kind of breaking even. The amount of benefit that they save is almost identical. It's $43 off over the course of 8 years. So it's essentially equal if they wanted to pay it off. So that's really interesting. Now change the math in any way. Let's put this back up to 4%. And you can see that the total interest compared to the total housing allowance saved, the gap ends up widening, right? So if you have like a crazy good scenario, like you got in at 3.25, then things are looking really good. But if you're at 4 or even like 4.5%, you can see that this gap here, which is reflected down here, gets wider and wider. So in this situation where you have same $80,000 to pay off in 96 months or 8 years, you would end up saving almost $4,000 net if you could just pay it off today. So meaning if you were to pay it off today, you would lose $11,000 over the course of 8 years. This is all over the course of 8 years. So 11,000 divided by 8. Let's do some quick math on that. So 11,449, 25 divided by 8 years. So you would pay about $1,430 a year extra in taxes because you couldn't claim your monthly P&I as part of your housing allowance, right? So you would lose $1,400 in tax benefits, but you would gain 15,410.44 divided by 8. You would gain $1,900 in saved interest payments, right? Because you're not paying the bank interest anymore. And so it ends up being a net positive. Even though you're giving up your housing allowance, you still save money in the long run by paying it off early with, say again, you get like an inheritance from somebody and you have the option, okay, do I want to pay this off immediately or not? So there's a lot of information that this tool is giving you, and it probably requires a little bit of help or guidance from someone like myself to really parse out what this means. And that's kind of what this video is meant to help you do. So I haven't even gotten into the refinance scenario. That's just looking at the current mortgage and just kind of seeing how good of a deal are you getting from your housing allowance versus the amount of interest that you're actually paying. All right, so now let's enter into the refinance scenario and let's look down here. Let's say that we can do a cash out refinance. Say you want to do some improvements on the home. You can do a cash out refinance and have it count towards your housing allowance, provided that you use the money that you pull out of the equity of the home towards improving the home or on the home in general, right? So if you have a repair or, something like that. And so, let's say you have a $20,000 remodel or repair or something. You have to get a new HVAC system and you want to redo the kitchen or something like that. And you say, you know what, I want to do a cash out refinance. I want to take $20,000 out so that my principal balance goes from 80,000 to an even 100,000. Interest rates are a little higher now, so that means your monthly P&I is going to go up, both because the principal amount is higher and also because the interest rate is higher. And let's make it a 10-year term, right? So it's 120 months. So we're in a situation right now where we have a 4.5% interest rate. We pay it off in 8 years. What if we wanted to do a cash out refinance, push it out to 10 years, milk that housing allowance benefit for a couple more years? Yeah, we have a higher interest rate, but does it make sense math-wise leveraging the housing allowance in order to make it all work? Well, this tells us exactly what it is. If we want, you don't have to, you really just look at these two numbers, and really the red one is the worst one, right? And so in this case, it's a bad idea. Like you end up paying roughly, looks like what, 11,000 more over the course of those 10 years doing that refinance than you would if you had just kept it the way it was. So that's something that's the immediate answer right there. But let's get down into the numbers to see what actually is going on. So again, your monthly P&I is 1097 and 1098. This is assuming that again you can take this full P&I as housing allowance over those 10 years. The total interest that you're going to pay over those 10 years is 31,723 at this 5.75%, right? And again, we can adjust all these numbers to make things different. But comparing that to the total interest that we would pay just keeping the mortgage, you can see that we're over doubling the amount of total interest you're paying. It doesn't seem like it's that different. It's like you're only taking out 20,000 more. You're increasing the size of the loan by 25%, and you're extending it out by a couple more years, and you're tacking on another 1.25% in interest. It doesn't seem like it's that much, but you can see in practice that doubles the amount of total interest that you're paying to the bank. Just those little changes. There's so much hidden cost in carrying debt, even mortgage debt. And then the housing allowance that you save over those 10 years ends up being about 15 grand. So you end up in the hole. You end up, accruing like $16,000 more in total liability over those 10 years, so like 1,600 a year, compared to where you are currently, where you're only in the hole about 4,000 over those same 10 years. And again, so when we're doing the comparison, we're looking over the time. This looks over the time period of whichever of these scenarios is longer. So, I changed for going from 96 to 120. This takes into account those extra 2 years where you're missing out on your housing allowance benefit for the monthly P&I, but you're also saving on the interest from not having a mortgage anymore. So let's mess with these numbers and let's see if we can find a scenario where it actually does make sense to refinance. Let's forget the cash out. Let's keep it 80,000. Let's say we can even get the same interest rate, and let's just push it out from 8 years to 10 years. And let's see what that does. Now that actually flips the situation. Now we see that the green is down here in the refinance scenario, because the net that you're paying is less in this refinance scenario than up here. So in this case, yes, you do pay extra in total interest. 15,000 in total interest over 8 years turns into 19,000 over 10 years. So your interest does go up. However, you're able to save more in housing allowance for getting to extend it over a longer period of time. And so it ends up being just barely over. But even in this situation, just paying it off, like say again, you got that $80,000, from an inheritance or what have you. If you immediately paid it off, you'd still save almost $4,000 over the course of those 10 years that we're considering, which is not this, which is more than you would save by refinancing. So even in this situation where refinancing and pushing the length of the loan out ends up being better for you mathematically, it's still not as good as just paying it off outright if you can do that. So I think so all of this to show you can play with these numbers and have some fun. But if you actually are considering refinancing your home, run it through something like this first. Give me a call and do a quick start session so that we can go over these numbers together. And we could save you thousands of dollars just by extracting out what you're actually paying for these, from this tool here, so that you can kind of eyes wide open go into the situation and decide what's best for your situation. I wanted to throw in a couple of more caveats. This just shows the math, right? So this just assuming all things being equal, and if you're just a penny pincher and you want to see, well, where am I better off mathematically, that's all this is showing you. What this does not show you are things like the peace of mind that you have, of having a paid off house, the risk that is involved in maintaining a mortgage if you don't necessarily have to. Things can change with your income. Things can change with the housing market. Things can change. There's all kinds of risk that you take on when you have debt. And so this assumes everything just goes without a hitch and nothing bad ever happens ever. Right. So that's the mathematical case this is making, but it doesn't take into account the emotional peace that you get from having the house paid off, everything like that. So keep that in mind, that the what this tool does for you, and also the limitations of what this tool does not show you. This is just showing you the math.